Um, my story is not really from the camps, anything like that. It's just a story of what happened to me during the war. The one thing that was wrong there, age 8 to 13, that's not how it worked. I was in hiding 3 years. And Anne Frank was in hiding 1.5 years. Can you hear me all? And she was betrayed and sent to the camp. Her parents, her father survived and found her diary, and that's why you all know about Anne Frank, I'm sure. I was in hiding for 3 years and was the sole survivor of my family. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever. And let me start in the beginning. I was 6 years old and living like a normal Jewish girl, but I was actually like this congregation, not really, well, I don't know how you feel, but I didn't feel Jewish. I didn't even know I was Jewish. We were very integrated with everybody in Holland at that time. And, but at the age of 6, my mother contracted TB in the hip. And she had to go to a sanatorium because in those days they didn't know about antibiotics and all that sort of thing. And while she was in her sanatorium for 3 years, I went to a home for children, not an orphanage, but just a home that looked after children that needed a home. My father carried on with his business, which was framing pictures in Amsterdam, and on the weekends he would come and fetch me from this home, and I would go and visit my mother in the sanatorium. This lasted for 3 years. But during those 3 years, at the age of 8, is when it all started. That was 1940. And what I couldn't understand was, I used to go to school with the daughter, she was a close friend of mine, we called each other sisters, with the daughter of the home. She was blonde and blue-eyed, and I had, well, you wouldn't see that today, but I had very dark hair and dark eyes and dark eyebrows. And we would walk to school, and on one corner we'd be shouted at, "You bloody Nazi." And we said, "What's this all about?" And on another corner we'd be called, "You bloody Jewess." So that's the first introduction I had that anything was wrong with the country. So we came home and we asked, what is this? What is this Nazi and Jewish girl? So they explained. And it turned out that the father of the home, whom I called father for 3 years, was actually a Nazi collaborator. And my father discovered this, and of course I couldn't stay there anymore. And at the same time, we were lucky my mother was freed, or she was finished with the sanatorium, so she came home. So at the age of 9, the war had already been for a year. Oh, one part I didn't mention is that when we were out either going to school or coming back from school, there was a big commotion, and my so-called sister and I were going to look, and there were these tanks coming in with the German soldiers. I mean, we were only children, so we didn't know what all this was about. And we were waving like everybody else. There I was waving to the Germans. Hello, you know. It's ridiculous. So then my father discovered, of course, I couldn't live there anymore, brought me home at the age of 9, and it was only the beginning of the war, so I lived a very good life. My father owned a very lucrative factory. My mother was still recuperating, so she wasn't working. I went to school, and life was good. We had a boat, we went on holidays, on vacations with the family, with my aunts and uncles. I've got pictures of this extended family all having a nice vacation. And then, slowly but surely, the restrictions started to come. The first restriction that I can remember is that I could not enter the school from the normal school entrance. I had to enter it for Jewish children. And in a large school, we had one little room, and we could only be taught by a Jewish teacher. So that was the first restriction. But as a child of 9, it's still, you don't realize what's going on, and my parents were the ones, I'm sure, that were worrying. And my father at that time could see the writing on the wall, and he had the money to book a boat to England so that we could escape what was going to happen, because he came from Vienna and he had seen what the Germans were like. And so we had the boat booked, and then unfortunately the TB came back. Just like today we talk about cancer. In those days we didn't have cancer, it was tuberculosis. And her tuberculosis came back, and we couldn't leave because she needed attention. She had tuberculosis of the hip, which meant that the hip was festering and had to be cleaned, had to be dressed, she had to be certain medicine. So that is what's happening in the beginning of the restrictions. I went to my Jewish classroom. Then we had to all be in by 8 o'clock at night. And Jewish people couldn't be out in the streets after 8. So I could only be friendly with Jewish children. I mean, can you believe this in a congregation like this? They had to be born Jewish or you couldn't mix with them. We could only shop in Jewish shops. And then the other restrictions came. The yellow star, I'm sure, does everybody know what the yellow star was about? So the yellow star had to be put on each garment. You know about that as well? So if I wore this, I had a yellow star, and if it was cold and I wore a jacket, my jacket would have the yellow star. And we just did it. And people said, afterwards I learned, that people said, but why? Why did you just do all these restrictions? Well, I'll give you an example of what happened in a street in Amsterdam, which I found out afterwards. Because don't forget, I'm telling you now when I was 9, and you don't know what an adult knows. So I heard this afterwards, that there was a group of people normally walking in Amsterdam, the Jews with their stars and the non-Jews with no stars. But one of the Jews wanted to be clever, and he decided, well, I'm not going to just be picked up because I'm wearing a star. I'm not going to wear a star. Because the vans were going round all the time, and there would be raids, and whoever had a star would be picked up, put in the van, and taken to the camps, which then were called labor camps to us. So we thought, well, Germany needs labor camps, and that's what's happening. So they were walking around in Amsterdam, and suddenly there was a bit of a commotion, and somebody said, what's going on there? And they said, well, don't go near there. There is something going on. I see the German soldiers. Well, what happened is that the German soldiers took this person who was not wearing a star, held them up in front of everybody, and said, this is an example of what happens to Jews who don't listen to our orders. And they shot him. So we all knew that if you don't do what they want to do, you'll just be shot. So it is easier to just listen to the restrictions. It'll all be over 3 months' time. It'll all be finished. Well, it wasn't, of course. And I'm actually thinking back. You showed a picture of Rotterdam. I was actually living there when the bombing started. The people of the home where I lived for 3 years, before I was taken out, in that year of the war, we all went to Rotterdam. I don't know why, but that is what we did. And when the bombing started, we went back to our home, which was called Zandvoort. If anybody knows it, it was a little village near the sea. So I have experienced the bombing. And now we were at the stage of the star, and the restrictions were becoming so strong. Then they made a law, a so-called law, that if one member of the family would volunteer to go to the labor camps, the rest of the family would be spared from going to the camps. Well, that was a very nice offer, we thought. So my eldest aunt, my mother's eldest sister, was not married, no children. She said, why shouldn't I go? I will go to the labor camp and I will save all of you from having to go there. So we all helped her prepare for her journey to the labor camp. She bought boots, we bought her warm clothes, and I remember that distinctly. We packed her suitcase, and we said goodbye, and thank you so much for saving us. So off she went. Well, after the war, I contacted the Red Cross, and I got all the details of my family with date of death. She was taken to Auschwitz, and she died in 1943. So now my parents realized that it was just becoming too dangerous, too many restrictions, and we feared for our lives. So my father contacted somebody, what was it again? From the resistance movement. I was saying that to her. I couldn't think of the word resistance. I kept thinking collaborator, but he was the opposite of collaborator. Oh, the figures that you showed of the deaths in Holland seems minimal compared to Poland and other countries on the east. But you must remember that Holland was a very, very small country. And we had the most Nazi-loving population. Actually, they were the ones that got most of the Jews killed because they actually went to the Nazis and pointed out who the Jews were. They also did that. But we had the largest number of Nazi supporters in Holland. So we started making plans, not me, I was 10. So now it started that we couldn't live in our house anymore. It was just too dangerous. The vans were pulling up and they were just taking people in the vans and taking them to the camps. Then it became known that these so-called restrictions were now becoming dangerous. Oh, of course we couldn't, but you know all that from reading. You couldn't sit on a seat not for Jews in the town. Have you all heard about that? We could not go to a swimming pool unless we couldn't go to swimming pools because there were non-Jews in it and it wasn't for Jews. So swimming pools were out. Benches in the street, it had a big sign, this is for Jews, and the other benches were for non-Jews. So I, as a Jew, could not sit on a certain bench. And, okay, now these restrictions still, oh, and then there's another incident I can tell you was interesting. Before we went into hiding, my father and I had made an appointment at the dentist. Now, we were wearing our stars, because if there was a collaborator of the Nazis who saw us walking without stars, as you can know now, we would be taken in and shot on the spot. So we wore our stars, but we had to be careful. Walking where we could think there were no Nazis. It took us a long, long time to get to the dentist. Stopping, starting, we got to the dentist. And as we got there, my father said to me, you know what, we're going home. I have a funny feeling, this is not right, we're going home. I said, but it took so long to get here, and so long to get an appointment. He says, we're going home. And we went home the same way, very slowly, carefully. We made it to our house, and the dentist called, and said, you are so lucky you didn't keep your appointment. We had a raid, and all the Jews were taken. So I don't know if any of you believe in this, but I believe in life after death, and I believe my father had a certain quality of just getting feelings. Maybe it was a warning, I don't know, but he was careful. And then started the planning for going into hiding. And my parents found this, what's his name? The resistance movement. I can never remember that name. The resistance movement man who helped the Jews to try and escape from all this horror. And he organized my father to stay in the factory, where my father hid in his own little office at the back. And his staff brought him food, did his washing and cleaning and looked after him and ran the business. Then my father would also run the business, but if somebody would come in who was not known to them, he would go hide in this little office. What happened to my father, I'm just jumping a bit because I'm on this subject now. So during that he had a year in hiding in his own office, and he used to write me stories because I was hiding somewhere else. I'll come to that just now. And I've still got this book where each night he would tell me a little story as a father to his daughter. And one of the stories was how he had a box of chocolate hidden, and he knew he shouldn't eat the whole box, and how he would put this box higher and higher, and until he needed a stepladder to put it high up, and he thought, well, now I won't get to it. But then he took a stepladder to get to the box, and in the end, a little story for me to feel that I know what he's doing every day. Well, one day there was a noise at night. It was dark. This I heard from his factory manager after the war, this story. And there was, because when the Jews were taken to the camps, they first, in Holland, had a place where they would meet first, where somebody that they knew could bring them a suitcase with clothing and whatnot for the so-called labor camp. So this manager told me afterwards that there was a noise outside. My father told him the story, and he didn't think that, not having seen sunlight for a year, he had a very white skin and black hair, and he did have a Jewish nose. So when he looked out of the window, there were some Nazis who weren't looking for him. They were looking for gas, petroleum, or whatever they were, in the yard, and they had a flashlight looking for these containers, and the flashlight went up to the window, and they said, oh, look, there's a Jew, which my father heard. Well, that was it, the end of him. They took him in, and he was allowed to contact one person for a suitcase for his labor in the labor camp, and the factory manager took him the suitcase. So that was what happened to my father. He died in Auschwitz in the gas chamber in 1943. And then, now I'm going back to when we all went in hiding. So he went into the factory. My mother and I had a place of hiding with people. And the way people took you in, most of the people, some obviously were very good and did it out of the kindness of their heart, but lots of people liked money. So my father, having money, paid for my mother and I to stay at a certain house. Now, by this time, I was 10, and I had to be my mother's nurse because she had TB of the hip. And I had to dress her wounds, which were just oozing. And so we stayed in that place for, I think it was 3 months. And the neighbors, by some way, got the knowledge that people, the Jewish people, were hiding next door to them. So they called the Nazis. And others heard about them saying, oh, you know, there are Jews living there. So they, in turn, warned us. So then my mother and I just went with the clothes we had in our back into the street, because we knew that once we were betrayed, the van would be there. We left that safe place early in the morning, and we walked. We walked the streets, knocking on doors, will you please take us in? And everybody said, it's too dangerous. We can't take that chance. We have a family ourselves. If we caught, our whole family goes. Well, by the end of the day, my mother was really ill and could hardly walk anymore. and I was in tears when we knocked on the last door and said, please, can you see my mother is ill? Will you take us in? We have nowhere to go. And this woman said, no, it's too dangerous, but there is a nurse. If you go there, and maybe she will take you in because your mother is ill, and she could pretend to be the nurse, which is what we did. The nurse took us in. She took one look at the two of us, and she said, I can have you as a patient, to my mother, but I can't have your daughter. She looks too Jewish. She can't possibly stay here. So my mother contacted this, his name was Up, what was it again? The resistance guy. That must be something psychological. And he went around looking for a place for me. And at this stage, it was getting very difficult. But he found me near the German border, a small village, and there was the Dutch Reformed minister. And he had taken in some other Jews already with false papers who didn't look very Jewish. And he said, all right, he will take me and he will pretend I am his little niece from Amsterdam. So my mother had to say goodbye to me, and then that was very dramatic. I mean, I can feel already I'm very composed. Usually when I tell this story, I break down, but I've said it so often. So we had to say goodbye. I was then 10, and my mother ill, and she knew that I was going somewhere, but by then people knew that the war wasn't just going to be a few months. So we had to say goodbye, and I left with this resistance, with the resistance Up, and I'll call him Up from now on. AB was his name. And he couldn't take any belongings of mine because he was taking me on a train to the minister, and a little Jewish-looking girl with a suitcase was just too obvious. I didn't have a star on then, we pretended. So he took me to the train. Well, let me now finish before I tell the story of what happened to me then, the 3 years in hiding. My mother stayed with this nurse, but she was not Jewish-looking. She had brown hair, green eyes, so she went into the street. And at that stage, everybody had to have rations for food, and those rations were done monthly, and she didn't have her papers up to date. So there was a search in the town, and they asked her, show us your papers, which again I heard, of course, later through Up, because he contacted me again after the war, which I'll tell you about. So he told me that my mother had her papers looked at, and they said, your papers are not up to date. They took her in. And she was allowed to phone somebody, so she phoned Up. So he knows what happened to her. Now, she was taken to this communal camp in Holland, and he arranged with her that at a certain place, the train that she would go on to Auschwitz or whichever, she went to Sorbitol, to her concentration camp, would go round a certain bend and slow down. She should open the door, roll out, and he'd be at the bottom for her. And he would hide her somewhere else. Well, unfortunately, either they had people listening in to the Jews having visitors, or whatever happened, she caught another train. So he knew when he was at the bottom waiting for her that she wasn't on the train that she was supposed to be. And I traced her through the Red Cross, but she had TB of the hip. So there was no way that she didn't go to the gas chamber, she didn't go to Auschwitz, she went to Sorbitol, but there's no way that she could survive on camp food. So they had her death too round about that area. where were we then? So now I was on my way on a train with no suitcase, the clothes that I had on, and going with a strange man up to a strange family. And he introduced me to the family, and the minister said, well, I will take her round to the village, introduce her as my little niece, and let's see what they all say, if they accept it. Well, of course, they didn't. They said, oh, minister, that's a little Jewish girl you've got there. That's not safe. So he came home, and they had a family meeting, the whole family. He had 5 children. He had another couple Jewish people staying there, and they all had a meeting, what are we going to do with Bertie? So they said, they concluded they couldn't keep me. So of course I burst into tears and said, well, now I was old enough to know what was going on. I said, well, what's going to happen to me? You're going to tell me you can't have me, where am I going to go? Nobody will want me anymore. So they sat again for a further meeting, and they felt sorry, and they said, I'll tell you what, we will cut off your, I had braids, long hair, we will cut off your hair, we will tint it blonde, we will tint your eyebrows blonde, then at least when somebody sees you, you won't look Jewish, but you won't be able to live like a normal little girl as our niece from Amsterdam. You've got to go into hiding. And they organized me a room like Anne Frank, a little attic. And they said, that is where you're going to be. But the war won't be so long. It'll just be a few months. And this turned out 3 years that I lived in that house, could not meet anybody except the people of the home. In the beginning, the first year, I went into the garden. They had chickens, rabbits, and I was allowed to feed the animals, and I remember picking lovely big strawberries, and I enjoyed it. I mean, obviously, the first few months I cried myself to sleep, because at the age of 10, knowing what is going on, it was just horrific. But then I got used to that way of living, and stayed in the house, and actually, like, I didn't say they treated me like a servant. They treated me very well, but it's not like in America. I did the dishes, I cleaned the potatoes, I did the washing, I put it out on the line, and if it is winter in Holland, it's very cold. And that's what I did the first year. I was allowed in the garden, but then, being a minister, the people of the village came to visit. So, and it was luckily a house surrounded by roads and land. You know, it's a small village and a big vicarage, and we could see people coming, or they could see people coming. And if somebody was coming towards the vicarage, I would be told to go up in my attic. And then during the day, I could, of course, have the house. I wasn't in the attic then. During the day, I could use the house. And then there was one of the 5 children was a teacher. Now she, luckily for me, had not TB. She pretended to have TB. She was born with a displaced hip. So she moved badly, and it hurt her a lot. And at the time that I came, she was at home because she couldn't teach. She was too much in pain. And she pretended, if Germans came, because Germans raided all the houses, she would say, don't come in here, I've got TB. And that was one way of keeping the Germans out of the house for the first 2 years, and kept me safe. Now, and she was, being a teacher, she would bring books into the house for me to learn. Now, I never saw children, never saw anybody else, but I saw the family, and she taught me as much as she could. And then, let's think what more. I'm trying to not make it too long. Yeah, in the last year, well, before I forget to tell you, this teacher, later, after the war, I actually went back and visited them. I'll do that later. I'll tell the other part later. Now, the last year of the war, just remind me that helps. Yeah. So the last year of the war, the Germans were beginning to retreat, and they were having trouble having accommodation for all their soldiers. So this being a very big house, they said to the minister, we want a third of your home, or a half, I can't remember how much, and we want to live there. So now he had the other couple and me, and he had another little Jewish girl that came from another orphanage that wouldn't keep her. So he had this house full of Jewish people, and the Germans in their uniforms came knocking on the door and said, we want to have half of your house, and we want your cellar, because we have our ammunition, and we need the ammunition to be safe. We're putting it in the cellar, and we will have one of our men parading the house. So that was very good for the Jews, because there was a Nazi parading around our house day and night for the ammunition to be safe. So which normal German would come and raid the house for other Jews? So that was the last year. Now, as I said, during the day, I could use the house, and I could play the piano. I'm trying to think where I had piano lessons. That must have been at home. The few good years I was taught the piano. So they had a big piano with a big seat, a double seat. Does anybody know what I mean by a double seat? A bench. And one day, they all went to church, and the elder daughter and I were the only ones at home, with the Germans in the other wing. And I went down and played the piano. So everything was fine, and she was standing in the kitchen, and she could hear me, and she could see me, and the next thing I felt, it was only her and me, and I felt somebody sitting next to me on that bench. I thought, what's going on? And they had taught me, if ever anybody sees you or talks to you, you're the little niece from Amsterdam, because now I had blonde hair and blonde and, didn't look Jewish. So they had taught me that, and just stick to that story. So I had a look, and it was a Nazi in uniform, sitting next to me, playing with me. He said, let's play double, four hands, the two people are playing. And he joined me in my piece. And I said, and he said, hello, I know you live here. And he says, and I know that you're a Jewish little girl. I said, no, I'm not. I'm the little niece from Amsterdam, the minister's little niece. He says, no, you're not. He said, I've watched you while we lived here. You don't go out. When people come, you disappear. And he says, and I'm telling you, I've got a little girl your age at home. And only because of that, because I would otherwise have taken the whole family. He says, but I'm thinking of my little daughter and identify with you. And he said, I'm not going to betray you. But, he says, all the other ones that are staying with me in this house, they don't know you're here, but they'll find out. So I suggest that you don't come down anymore and just stay in your attic, which I had to do for the rest of the war, which was another whole year. I stayed only in the attic. That was that story. And then came the Canadians. We were liberated by the Canadians, and we had to be in the shelters, under the, what are they called? Air raid shelters. So that's another part of my life where we used to just go down in the air raid shelter and hear the bombing. And then one day, there were the liberators, and they came to our house, and they were handing out chocolates and cigarettes. And I didn't know a word of English. And I said, I was now 13, right? So I'd been in hiding from 10 to 13, 3 years. And I ran out, and I said, oh, the teacher friend, Han, the eldest daughter, had taught me to say, I am Jewish. So I ran out to these soldiers and I said, I am Jewish. So they said, good. And they handed me chocolates. And to this day, I'm a chocoholic, unfortunately. Yeah. And then, well, it was just celebration and celebration, of course. We stood in the streets, and this time I was waving the Canadians coming in. And then Upcock had, I was free. He came to the house. And he then told me that there was nobody of my whole family that survived. And I got a few of the stories too. I had a grandmother who was in a wheelchair. And when they came for her, just one of the horror stories, she was on the first floor, second floor as you call it here. And we always say that the one up is the first floor. But here, the first floor is on the ground. So they just took her in her wheelchair and threw her down the stairs. So these are the stories that I got back from all the neighbors. So Upcock told me that I'm on my own. There is nobody anymore. The minister at that stage, oh, by the way, seeing that you are Messianic Jews, I want to tell you that for 3 years, while I stayed with the minister, I actually became also converted. I believed, or not converted Jewish. I knew I was Jewish by then, but I went to church one night with him when we thought it was safe, and I accepted their belief. I became... and because obviously they brought me up in their religion, Dutch Reformed. But I must say today I am just Jewish, but not overly religious. I know I'm Jewish, and that's why I lost all my family. But I'll come to the present part just now. So where were we now? What was that? Oh, the chocolates and the... Okay, I know. And that Up said that everybody has gone. And then the minister said, unfortunately, I cannot keep you forever. I can't educate you. I haven't got the money for that. You'd have to go to an orphanage. Now, that was a big shock. Now I had to go to an orphanage. And Up said, first, go around to all your family. So now I was 13. All the addresses where your family lived, and see who's coming back. You may not have to go to an orphanage, you may have family. Well, I went to all the addresses, and they told me nobody has come back. Now what happened, I was living then at the minister. And for a while, before what I was going to tell you now, for a while I actually moved in, I remember, with Up, the resistance fighter, and he said, stay with me in Amsterdam. I'll introduce you to Jewish youth groups, because I knew in words I was Jewish, but I didn't know what it was all about. So has anybody here heard of Habonim? No? It's just a Jewish youth movement in Holland. They train them. Habonim, you do camps and learning, and then you go to Israel. That sort of organization. And I and other Jewish survivors attended Habonim, and I got to know what Jewishness was all about. And then Up also entered me into a Montessori school. Because now remember, although Han, the teacher, had given me some books, I hadn't been educated for 3 years. So I went to he put me into the Montessori school, which was very good. By the way, was a child psychologist by profession. And he was very wonderful to me because when I heard I was the only one, I just said to him, well, that's it. I'll just commit suicide. How do I go on? So he helped me a lot by putting me into groups with children, putting me into the Montessori school, where you advance according to your ability. You haven't got rigid teaching. So, and I was now but I was just eager to learn. And one thing that my father had always told me when all this started was just remember, what you have in your head, they cannot take away from you. So when I speak to schools, that's what I tell the children. It doesn't matter if you're poor, if you haven't got clothes. What you have in your head is what will get you through life, get you the jobs and get you the security. And so all I knew was what my father had taught me, I must learn. So at this Montessori school, where it was a period of about a year, I just learned and learned and learned. And then I went back I stayed up for a while he did all that for me. Then I went back to the minister that part I'm vague. I don't know why I was back at the minister, but something very exciting happened. One day, there was a knock at the door, and 2 soldiers in the British uniform stood at the door. And they said to me, "We are your extended family. We have been in the British Brigade to fight the Nazis. And we have come back to Amsterdam to look for any relatives that are survivors. And everywhere we went, we heard about you, a 13-year-old little girl that's living with a minister." So I said, "And what are you going to do with me?" So he said, well, one of them was too young. He lived in Belgium, and he was much too young. But the other one was older, and he said, well, my parents have lost their daughter, who went together with my wife to England when they lived in South Africa. That's how I got there. That's where I got to learn English. My grandfather had 5 brothers. It was one of 5 brothers. And my grandfather was the youngest. His eldest brother went to live in Johannesburg, because in Holland there was the diamond trade. And lots of the Dutch Jews went to live in South Africa, in Johannesburg, where they built up their diamond trade. He says, my father lives there, and I had a sister, and then I had a sister, and my sister married a friend of his. So the 2 men were in the Dutch Brigade in England, and their 2 wives. They were both family. The 2 wives went on a boat to visit their husbands in England, and that boat got torpedoed. That was at the end of the war. So his parents lost their daughter, and they said, we will adopt her, our eldest brother's grandchild. So that is how I went to South Africa. And I had no papers. I just had no papers. So how am I going to get to South Africa? How do I enter South Africa? So my mother's first cousin, that's what he was, he said, I will smuggle you on the boat. He had to go back to South Africa on the boat as a soldier, right? So he put me in a uniform. And he put me into his cabin. And he said, now, you stay in this uniform. Anybody who comes into this cabin has no idea you're there because I'm going to smuggle you in. And you'll just be asleep. They'll just think you're another soldier. And that is how I left Holland to enter South Africa. And I was the first war orphan to enter South Africa without speaking a word of English. And, that's not really the war years, so you don't want to know that. So I'll just make it very simple. I was then introduced, without speaking English, to the Dutch community in Johannesburg. And the Dutch community had... The man who adopted me, my grandfather's eldest brother, owned a diamond factory. You wouldn't believe this, but he owned a diamond factory, but he actually stopped me from studying. That's another little story. So, have I got time to tell a little bit more? How long have I been speaking? Okay. Okay, it's nearly finished, this little story. So they organized a gathering of the diamond cutters and their friends to meet this little girl from Amsterdam. And at this meeting of people, I couldn't speak to anybody, and I was really looking awful. I'd come out, whether it was nutrition or what, but I'd come off the boat, bloated, pimples all over the place, not very attractive. And then the people that adopted me, my uncle and aunt, I called them, had no idea. Their daughter was already next generation. So they dressed me for this party in a little dress which didn't accentuate what was not good. I mean, it accentuated what was not good. I was in at the waist, had a big red heart over my one bosom. They put my hair with little clips. I was wearing black shoes and socks. It was just I didn't look nice. And I sat in the corner, and I couldn't speak English. And I saw these three nice young men, about 5 years older than me. And that's all I can remember of that party. I felt horrible. And 5 years later, I was then 19. I didn't wear my glasses. I was 19, as a 19-year-old girl looks. And I was at another party it was a musical evening, with another boy. I was 19. And at this party was this man who came up to me, and he said, what's your name? So I said, Bertie Blom. He said, are you related to that little girl that the Bloms adopted? So I said, no. I am that girl. I am Bertie Blom. Oh, he said, ugly duckling turned swan. I'm sorry my husband isn't here to hear this, but he's not well, otherwise he would have come. He would have loved your service today. So he said, may I take you out? I said, of course. I thought, oh, wow. He's 5 years older, and I looked up at this, what I thought was a handsome guy. And 9 months later, we were engaged, and 9 months later, we were married. And we were married today. We married 62 years. And we had together, I'll just tell you this quickly, he helped me finish my university degree. The people that adopted me took me out of school when I was in standard 8. You go up to 10 there. And they said, you can become a hairdresser like our daughter was. There's no need to study because you'll marry a nice Jewish boy and you won't have to have an education. That is her attitude. It was an old Jewish person from London, Cockney. That was her attitude. And I said, no, I'd like an education. So what I did, they provided, I went back to the minister, and saw everybody again and fixed things up. And there was some reparation to survivors of the Holocaust. And I told them, do not send that money in a lump sum, because my people don't believe in education, the ones that adopted me. Send it out at £10. It was then £10 a month. And I started going to night school and got my, do you call it matric? Standard 10 here, right? High school. I got the high school certificate by studying at night. I had a job as a bookkeeper typist. I had been trained by, they did pay for my college for that, short and typing bookkeeping. So what I earned with that, I went to night school and a bit from Holland. Then I went and spoke to the university and said, I would like to become a doctor. You know how they advise students? And they said, well, a doctor is impossible while you work, because that's... But they gave me the opportunity to become a social worker, and they would pay for my studies. But it had to go before a committee, and forms had to be filled in. So I said to my adopted father, as I say, relative, but adopted legally, that he's got to fill the papers in, and please don't put what you earn, because I'll never get this loan. And what he thought was a small amount was too much for the meeting. And they sat and they came back to me. They said, sorry, we can give you £25 as a gesture, but we cannot. You've been legally adopted by somebody who can pay for your university. So I thought, well, then I'll do it myself. And that's what I did. I went to work as a short and typing bookkeeper, and at night took my degree to enter university. I met my husband when I was in my first year of university. He was then already qualified as an accountant, and he encouraged me all the way. And I got my BA degree, and I was going to go on to psychology. And then it was difficult for Jewish people, my husband, a Jewish man, to find a job. I mean, that was already then. And so we've had an opportunity to go to Zambia. Anybody here heard of Zambia? The middle of Africa. And we went there as we'd been married 1 year, and we packed up and we went to Zambia. And there I taught for a while as a teacher with a BA. And then I joined my husband, who left the job that he went to, and we started our own accounting practice in Zambia. And we had a wonderful life. You know, Zambia in those days, it sounds horrible, but we had 3 full-time servants. I mean, it's unbelievable. It was a very good life, and we had 6 children. And our children today they're all humanities. A doctor, he's a pediatric intensivist. I'm not showing off, but I'm just saying what came from... What came from a little girl who wasn't allowed to even educate herself. He is a pediatric intensive care doctor at CHOC. My second daughter was a teacher. I mean, she still is a teacher, but she's not working because, unfortunately, she has ovarian cancer. She's not feeling too well at the moment either. Otherwise, she would have been here. Then I have another daughter who's a nurse. She lives in New Jersey. Then my fourth one, she was a twin, and I lost a little boy in Zambia. That's when we decided to move out, because that became a second world country. We went back to Johannesburg. And then I had one more son to replace the twin, and that's another story. He died. He had schizophrenia, and he went living on the streets for 10 years. And we supported him financially, but mentally he didn't want treatment. And then the twin is an occupational therapist. So they're all doing good for humanity. So that I feel I have achieved. And have I mentioned all 4 kids, all 6 kids? Yeah, 2 died, and right. And that's what it's all about. That's why I'm here. Just